As promised, we are joined by Tripp Mickle from the New York Times to talk a little bit about Apple and its relationship with China. Tripp, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Tripp, Apple has built an empire with China in terms of the iPhone production and the manufacturing capabilities that China has. Really, over the last decade, they fueled a tremendous amount of growth for Apple. But now, as globalization of our worldwide economy seems to be shifting, and there is consistent concerns regarding the policy regime there, as well as their relations with the United States, what changes has Apple been forced to make or reconsider regarding its relationship with China?
Apple's been really caught by this wave of protectionism that's sweeping across the U.S., where you have an increased amount of concern about China's potential national security threat and some of its posturing as it pertains to Taiwan. And in the wake of all of that, one of the more fascinating developments that occurred this year was that congressional leaders in Washington started to take an interest in Apple's supply chain, and this one obscure Chinese chip maker named YMTC that Apple was considering and talking to for use in future iPhones. They make a memory chip, and this raised alarm among U.S. congressional leaders, and they kind of swung into action to try to block this, which just represents a big change in Washington in terms of the degree to which they're willing to go to intervene to impede Apple's use of some Chinese suppliers that historically they've been able to use without interference at all.
I want to dive in a little bit more on YMTC because you're right, it was fascinating for me to read about. So basically, Apple was in discussions with them in March regarding that memory chip that you mentioned, and I was unaware that 25% of the material cost for the iPhone comes down to that memory chip, and it seemed as if YMTC would be able to offer it to Apple very cheaply, and a part of that could be because of its government subsidy status. What has gone on with YMTC in terms of some of the regulations or legislations rather that have been issued by the U.S. government, and where that relationship with Apple stands today?
Right. In October, the Department of Commerce issued new guidelines related to 31 firms in China and penalized them. And YMTC was one of the firms on that list, and one of the penalties that YMTC is facing is that American companies are told they can't supply YMTC with machinery and engineering support to develop chips on an ongoing basis. And the company had recently built a huge new factory in Wuhan. It was going to be its second one, and according to analysts, they're not going to be able to fill that new factory out with the American machinery that they need to make it operational. And so this is a huge hindrance to its ability to supply, almost any company, including Apple, going forward. And it just threw a wrench in the company's plans.
Tripp, are you concerned about Apple's future? Because a naive person might just say, well, no longer manufacture in China, right? Just pick a different country. But it seems like their roots are very deeply embedded there. We're talking about 3 million workers. It seems like this is a significant future concern for Apple, because it's not like they can just turn things around and change manufacturing to India or Vietnam just at the snap of their fingers.
This is a real backbone of Apple's business. You said a decade, but we're talking about going back to early 2000s when Apple really began to build up its operations in China. And one of the things that China offers that is hard to come by elsewhere is hundreds of thousands of workers who can work on a seasonal basis. If you'll recall, Apple releases like clockwork a new iPhone every single fall. And from the summer all the way up until kind of Christmas, they bring in hundreds of thousands of seasonal workers to a handful of factories across China who assemble those iPhones, and then they return to kind of their rural towns. And maybe they come back the next year, maybe they don't. But there's this endless supply of workers that are willing to be work on a flexible basis, and that's a huge facet of what China offers that Apple can't really replace in an easy fashion elsewhere. And people who have visited the factories that it's beginning to set up in Vietnam and India have talked about just how small they are in scale relative to what they're accustomed to seeing Apple run in China itself.
Certainly something to watch going forward. That's Tripp Mickle from the New York Times talking to us about Apple and its relationship with China. Great piece that he's done here. Tripp, thanks so much for the time.
Thanks so much for having me.